March 15th, 1945. In the small Bavarian village of Wiesenfeld, nestled between rolling hills dusted with the last remnants of winter snow, a German woman named Margarete Hoffmann stood at her cottage window, scanning the road that led into town. She was certain that the letter from the Wehrmacht was mistaken, that her husband Franz would return home any day now from the Eastern Front. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What Margaret could not possibly imagine that spring morning was how an American prisoner of war, bearing an uncanny resemblance to her presumed dead husband, would not only challenge everything she believed about her enemies, but would ultimately restore her faith in humanity during mankind's darkest hour. The small village of Wiesenfeld had remained largely untouched by the direct violence of the war, its remoteness serving as both isolation and protection, yet the conflict had taken nearly every able-bodied man, leaving behind a community of women, children and the elderly to maintain what semblance of normal life they could. The village church bells, once rung to celebrate weddings and births, now more commonly tolled for memorial services. Margarete Hoffmann, 32 years old with auburn hair, usually hidden beneath a worn headscarf, had received the notification 3 months earlier. The official letter stated that her husband, Oberfeldwebel Franz Hoffmann, of the 527th Infantry Regiment, had perished during the retreat from Leningrad. The paper was crisp and formal, offering condolences from a regime that was itself in the throes of collapse. Margaret had read the letter exactly once before placing it in a drawer, refusing to accept its finality. "They have made a mistake," she told her neighbor, Elsa Bauer, as they worked together in the community garden plot. "Franz promised he would return. He has never broken a promise to me." Elsa, whose own husband had been killed in North Africa 2 years earlier, merely nodded, understanding that denial was often the first refuge of a new widow. "The potatoes need more attention than the carrots this year," she replied, changing the subject to spare her friend additional pain. Margaret's cottage stood at the edge of the village, a modest stone structure with a thatched roof that needed repair in several places. Inside, a portrait of Franz hung above the fireplace, a handsome man with a strong jaw, kind eyes, and a distinctive scar above his right eyebrow from a childhood accident. Each night, Margaret spoke to this image as if Franz could hear her, updating him on the day's events, the progress of their vegetable garden, and how she had managed to repair the chicken coop without assistance. "Herr Müller says he can spare some roofing material next month," she told the portrait one evening in early March. "I told him we could wait, that perhaps you would be home by then to do it properly." She paused, wiping flour from her hands onto her apron. "The radio says the Americans are crossing the Rhine now. Everyone is frightened, but I am not. Perhaps when they come, they will bring news of you." 20 kilometers away, in a hastily established prisoner of war camp outside Munich, Technical Sergeant James Miller of the United States 101st Airborne Division sat on his bunk, studying the German vocabulary list he had compiled in a small notebook made from scraps of paper. Miller, a former high school history teacher from Pennsylvania, had been captured during the failed Operation Market Garden in the Netherlands in September 1944. "Miller, why do you bother with that?" "War's almost over," remarked Corporal Pete Donovan, watching his bunkmate from across the barracks. Miller, without looking up, replied, "Knowledge is never wasted, Donovan. Besides, speaking their language has already earned me better treatment from the guards." This was true. Miller's growing proficiency in German had made him valuable as an informal interpreter between prisoners and guards, a position that occasionally resulted in extra rations or less demanding work assignments. At 34 years old, Miller was somewhat older than many of the men in his division. He had enlisted relatively late, moved by the stories of Nazi atrocities that had begun filtering back to the United States. With his brown hair, strong jawline, and a small scar above his right eyebrow from a baseball injury in his youth, he had the look of a man who could be trusted, a quality that had served him well as both a teacher and a soldier. "The Russians will be in Berlin before summer," said another prisoner. Private First Class Samuel Weiss, an intelligence specialist who had been monitoring the guards' conversations. "Germans know they've lost, just a matter of time now." Miller nodded in agreement but said nothing. He had been having disturbing dreams lately, Not of combat or capture, but of returning home to find his house occupied by strangers who did not recognize him. The dreams left him with a lingering sense of displacement that followed him throughout his waking hours. The camp commander, Hauptmann Werner Keller, was a career officer in his 50s who had been deemed too old for frontline service. He ran the camp with strict efficiency, but without unnecessary cruelty, a stance increasingly rare as Nazi desperation grew with each passing week of Allied advances. "We require 10 men for agricultural work detail tomorrow," Keller announced during evening roll call. "The assignment will be for 2 weeks minimum. Volunteers will receive additional rations." Miller raised his hand immediately. Any chance to leave the confines of the camp, even for hard labor, was an opportunity worth taking. 9 other men joined him, and the next morning they were loaded onto a transport truck destined for the farmlands surrounding Wiesenfeld. As the truck rumbled through the countryside, Miller observed the changing landscape with a historian's eye. Bavaria's natural beauty remained evident despite the war: verdant fields, dense forests, and picturesque villages that seemed pulled from fairy tales rather than a nation in its death throes. "Where do you think they're taking us?" asked Private Johnson, a young soldier from Oklahoma. "Somewhere with food shortages," Miller replied. "Late winter is always the hardest time for rural communities. Their stored harvest is running low and spring planting hasn't begun." The truck eventually stopped in Wiesenfeld's small town square. The prisoners, under the watchful eyes of 4 guards, were divided into smaller groups and assigned to various agricultural tasks throughout the area. Miller, along with Privates Johnson and Weiss, was directed toward a cluster of farms at the village edge. Sergeant Hans Gruber, a wounded veteran now serving in the Volkssturm, Germany's desperate last-ditch home defense force, composed of those previously deemed unfit for military service, led their group. Gruber walked with a pronounced limp, the result of a Soviet mortar in '43. "You will work from sunrise to sunset," Gruber explained in halting English. "No escape attempts. The nearest Allied forces are still far away, and the locals will not help you." He paused, then added with unexpected frankness, "Work well, and you will be treated well. Germany has little food to spare, but farm workers must eat to work." Their first assignment was at the Bauer farm, where Elsa Bauer directed them to repair fences and prepare fields for planting. As they worked, Miller noticed an auburn-haired woman watching them from a neighboring property. She stood perfectly still, her gaze fixed upon him with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. "That one's staring at you, Miller," Johnson muttered, nodding toward the woman. "Probably never seen an American before," Miller replied, though he sensed something more complex in her scrutiny. The woman disappeared into her cottage, only to emerge minutes later with Sergeant Gruber. They spoke animatedly, the woman gesturing toward Miller several times during their conversation. "Prisoner Miller," Gruber called. "Come here." Miller set down his tools and approached cautiously, aware that his fellow prisoners had stopped working to observe the exchange. "This is Frau Hoffmann," Gruber said. "She has requested your assistance with farm tasks on her property. I have approved this request." Miller looked at the woman, Frau Hoffmann, more closely now. She appeared to be in her early 30s, with tired eyes that nonetheless held a fierce determination. She studied his face with unsettling focus, particularly the scar above his right eyebrow. "Danke, Sergeant Gruber," she said, not taking her eyes off Miller. Then, in accented but clear English, "You will come with me now, American." With a nod from Gruber granting permission, Miller followed Margaret Hoffmann to her cottage. The property was well maintained, despite clear signs of struggle. A partially collapsed chicken coop had been repaired with mismatched materials, and the garden showed evidence of careful maximization of limited space. Inside the cottage, Miller immediately noticed the portrait above the fireplace. The resemblance was startling, a man who could have been his brother, down to the placement of the scar above his right eyebrow. Understanding dawned immediately. "Frau Hoffmann," he began carefully, "I am not—" "You will help me repair the roof," she interrupted, her voice firm but not unkind. "And then the chicken coop needs proper rebuilding. After that, the north field must be prepared for planting." Miller hesitated, unsure how to address the obvious misunderstanding without causing distress. Before he could speak again, Margaret continued, I have told Sergeant Gruber that I recognized you as a man who once worked on my father's farm before the war. This gives reason for requesting you specifically." Her eyes held his, communicating something beyond her words. "It would be best if you did not contradict this story." Miller understood the implicit arrangement. For whatever reason, delusion, desperation, or calculation, this woman was creating a scenario where he would receive better treatment than in the work detail or the camp. While the ethical implications troubled him, survival instinct prevailed. "I understand," he replied simply. Over the next 3 days, Miller worked alongside Margaret Hoffman, repairing her roof, reinforcing the chicken coop, and preparing her fields for planting. They spoke little during their labors, but he noticed how she would sometimes pause to watch him, particularly when she thought he was not aware of her gaze. Each evening, Sergeant Gruber would arrive to return Miller to the temporary holding area established in the village schoolhouse where the prisoners slept, and each morning Gruber would deliver him back to the Hoffman cottage. On the 4th day, as they broke for a midday meal of thin vegetable soup and a precious slice of dark bread, Margaret finally spoke about what they both knew but had not acknowledged. "My husband's name is Franz," she said, setting down her spoon. "He was reported killed on the Eastern Front 3 months ago. I received a letter." Miller set down his own spoon, choosing his next words carefully. "Frau Hoffmann, I do not believe he is dead," she continued, as though Miller had not spoken. "The letter said his body was not recovered. There was confusion during the retreat. Many men were separated from their units." Miller nodded, understanding the universal hope of those left behind in wartime, that official reports were mistaken, that loved ones might still return. "The resemblance between you and Franz is remarkable," Margaret said, glancing toward the portrait. "When I first saw you in the square, I thought—" She stopped, embarrassed by the admission. "It's a natural reaction," Miller offered gently. "I understand." "I know you are not my husband," she said firmly, meeting his eyes. "I am not delusional, despite what the village may think, but the resemblance has provided an opportunity that benefits us both." "How so?" Miller asked. "You receive better food and treatment than your fellow prisoners, and I receive help with tasks I cannot manage alone." She hesitated before adding, "And perhaps for a brief time the village gossips will believe that the notification was indeed a mistake, and I might be spared their pity." The pragmatism of her explanation surprised Miller. What he had assumed might be a widow's delusion was instead a calculated decision by a survivor determined to manage her circumstances as best she could. "I appreciate your honesty, Frau Hoffmann," he said, "and I'm grateful for the arrangement." "Margaret," she corrected. "If we are to continue this deception successfully, you should call me Margaret when others are present." That evening, after Gruber had taken Miller back to the schoolhouse, Private Weiss approached his bunk with evident curiosity. "What's happening with the widow, Miller?" he asked in a low voice. "The guards are talking. They say she believes you're her husband." "It's not like that," Miller replied, though he realized he wasn't entirely sure what it was like. "She knows I'm American. She's lonely and needs help with her farm. It's a mutually beneficial arrangement." Weiss raised an eyebrow skeptically but didn't press further. The following week established a routine. Miller would work on Margaret's property during the day, taking meals with her, and return to the schoolhouse at night. Gradually, their conversations extended beyond immediate tasks to cautious personal revelations. Miller learned that Margaret had been a school teacher before the war, specializing in literature. Her husband Franz had owned a small woodworking shop in the village, creating furniture and household items until conscription had taken him away in 1942. They had been married for 8 years, but had no children, a source of private sorrow, she admitted, only after several days of building trust. In turn, Miller shared his own history as a teacher, his home in Pennsylvania, and his interest in European history that had become unexpectedly personal through his military service. He was careful, however, not to discuss military matters or express political opinions that might strain their fragile connection. The resemblance between Miller and Franz became both the foundation of their arrangement and an unspoken barrier. Margaret never explicitly pretended Miller was her husband, but the physical similarity, allowed villagers to draw their own conclusions when they occasionally worked within sight of curious observers. Elsa Bauer visited on the 8th day, bringing a small jar of preserved cherries, a precious gift in those times of scarcity. Her eyes widened slightly when she saw Miller working in the garden, but she said nothing directly about his presence or appearance. "The American prisoners are proving useful," Elsa commented carefully as she and Margaret stood watching Miller turn the soil. "Herr Müller says the 3 at his farm have already prepared twice the land he could have managed alone." "This one works hard," Margaret replied neutrally. "He has some experience with farming from before the war." Elsa studied her friend's face. "You seem better, Margaret. Less distant than you have been since the letter came." "Having help makes a difference," Margaret acknowledged. "The work does not seem so impossible now." After Elsa departed, Miller noticed a subtle change in Margaret's demeanor, a withdrawal into herself, a return of the sadness that had begun to soften during their days of shared labor. "Your friend seems kind," he ventured, as they worked side by side, planting potatoes. "Elsa lost her husband 2 years ago in Africa," Margaret responded after a long pause. "She understands grief, but also how life continues afterward." She pushed a potato cutting deeper into the soil with unnecessary force. "She believes I should accept Franz's death and begin considering that continuation. And you're not ready for that," Miller observed. "Would your wife be ready if she received a letter about you?" Margaret challenged, then immediately regretted the personal question. "I apologize, that was inappropriate." "I'm not married," Miller said simply. "There was someone once before the war, but she didn't wait for me to return." Margaret looked genuinely surprised. She must have been a fool. The comment hung between them, more revealing than either was prepared to acknowledge. They returned to their planting in silence, but something had shifted in their careful dynamic. That night, as Sergeant Gruber arrived for the daily return to the schoolhouse, Margarete made an unexpected request. "Sergeant, the Northfield preparation must be completed before the rain comes tomorrow. Having the prisoner return to the schoolhouse and then back here wastes valuable working hours. I request permission to have him remain here overnight to continue work at first light." Gruber frowned, considering the request. "Regulations require prisoners to be secured each night." "My late husband's hunting rifle is still in the house," Margaret said, "and the prisoner has shown no inclination toward escape. Where would he go? The Americans are still far away, and he speaks German poorly." Miller remained silent, eyes downcast in the appropriate posture of subservience expected from a prisoner, while internally surprised by Margaret's unexpected maneuver. After further consideration, Gruber nodded. "Very well. But this is your responsibility, Frau Hoffmann. If he escapes, there will be severe consequences." "I understand," Margaret replied solemnly. After Gruber departed, Miller turned to Margaret with a questioning look. "The weather report mentioned nothing about rain tomorrow." "The radio has been wrong before," she replied, not meeting his eyes. "The shed has a cot where Franz used to rest when working late. You can sleep there." That evening brought a new awkwardness to their interaction. They ate a simple dinner in relative silence, the absence of Gruber's impending arrival creating an unexpected intimacy neither had anticipated. "Thank you," Miller said finally, breaking the silence, "for the arrangement with Gruber. It's a kindness I didn't expect." Margaret nodded, still not meeting his gaze. "The work is easier with consistent help. It makes practical sense." But they both recognized the explanation as incomplete. Something more complex was developing, not romance exactly, but a human connection that transcended their assigned roles as enemy and captor, prisoner and widow. As Miller prepared to retire to the shed, Margaret suddenly spoke. "Why did you volunteer to come here, to Wiesenfeld for the work detail?" The question surprised him with its directness. "Anything was better than remaining in the camp," he answered honestly. "And I thought farm work meant potential access to food. A survivor's choice," she acknowledged, "like many we all make now." "And you?" Miller asked. "Why did you choose to create this arrangement between us?" Margaret considered the question carefully. "At first, it was the resemblance. It startled me, but then—" She paused, searching for words. "It was your eyes, You look at things as Franz did, taking in details, noticing what needs fixing, what can be saved. It's rare, that way of seeing. The observation touched Miller unexpectedly deeply. I should go to the shed, he said, suddenly uncomfortable with the direction of their conversation. Of course, Margaret replied, her practical tone returning. We start at dawn. In the shed, lying on the narrow cot that still held the faint imprint of another man's form, Miller stared at the rough wooden ceiling. The situation had grown more complicated than he had anticipated. Margaret Hoffman was not the delusional widow he had initially assumed, nor was she simply using him for physical labor. She was a complex woman fighting for survival in her own way, and he found himself increasingly drawn to her strength and resilience. The following morning, they worked side by side in the north field, the promised rain nowhere in evidence. By midday, Miller had grown bold enough to address the deception directly. There was never any rain forecast, was there? He asked as they paused to drink water from a shared canteen. Margaret shook her head slightly. The nights in the schoolhouse are cold and the food is poor. You work better when you are properly rested and fed. Is that the only reason? Miller pressed, surprising himself with his directness. Margaret set down the canteen, her expression unreadable. What other reason would there be, Technical Sergeant Miller? The use of his full rank and surname, information she must have obtained from Gruber, served as a reminder of the reality of their situations. Whatever connection they had formed existed within the rigid constraints of a world at war, with all its divisions and dangers. None that matters, Miller replied, returning to his work. As April progressed, the arrangement continued. Miller now spent most nights in the shed behind Margaret's cottage, returning to the schoolhouse only for cursory inspections by higher-ranking officers who occasionally visited the village. The other prisoners regarded him with a mixture of envy and suspicion, his privileged position creating an inevitable distance. You're getting comfortable, Miller, Private Weiss remarked during one such return to the schoolhouse. Don't forget which side you're on. I haven't forgotten anything, Miller replied evenly, including that survival is our first duty as prisoners, yet privately he questioned whether his motivations remained so straightforward. The lines between pragmatism and genuine attachment to Margaret Hoffman had begun to blur in ways that left him unsettled. News of the war's progression reached Wiesenfeld in fragments, rumors carried by supply trucks, official announcements on the village's few radios, and increasingly nervous directives from regional authorities. The Third Reich was collapsing, though few dared say so explicitly. On a warm afternoon in late April, as Miller and Margarete worked to repair a section of fence, an unusual sound drew their attention skyward. A formation of American bombers passed high overhead, heading eastward, unchallenged by the once-feared Luftwaffe. They fly to Munich now without escort fighters, Margaret observed quietly. The end is coming, isn't it? Miller nodded, watching the silver aircraft until they disappeared. Yes, weeks, not months now. A complicated expression crossed Margaret's face, part relief, part apprehension. What happens when your army arrives here? The question addressed what they had both been avoiding. Miller's status would reverse overnight, from prisoner to liberator, while Margaret would become part of the defeated population. The American forces have strict protocols for occupied territories, Miller explained. Civilians who haven't participated in atrocities have nothing to fear. And what about... Margareta hesitated. What about arrangements like ours? A German woman harboring an American prisoner? You've treated me humanely, Miller said firmly. Better than humanely. Any American officer would recognize that. Margaret nodded, though uncertainty remained in her eyes. And afterward? When the war is truly over? Miller understood the real question beneath her words. What would happen to their connection when the artificial constraints that had created it no longer existed? I don't know, he admitted honestly. None of us knows what the world will look like afterward. That evening, as they sat by the small fireplace in Margaret's cottage, the portrait of Franz looking down upon them, she made an unexpected request. Tell me about your home, she said, your real home in America. What will you return to when this is over? Miller described his small house in a Pennsylvania suburb, the high school where he had taught history, the quiet life he had left behind when he enlisted. As he spoke, he realized how distant that life now seemed, belonging to a different man in a different world. "It sounds peaceful," Margaret observed when he finished. "Do you think you will find it the same when you return?" "No," Miller admitted. "Nothing will be the same, not the place and not the person returning to it." "War changes everything it touches," Margaret agreed, "even those of us who never saw the battlefields." A log shifted in the fireplace, sending up a shower of sparks. In the dancing light, Margaret's face showed every hardship she had endured, but also the strength that had carried her through them. "May I ask you something, Margaret?" Miller said, using her first name directly for the first time. She nodded, her expression guarded. "The portrait," he said, nodding toward the image of Franz above the fireplace. "The resemblance between us, is it really as strong as it first seemed to you?" Margaret rose and stood before the portrait, studying it carefully. "There are differences," she admitted. "His jaw was softer. Your eyes are a different shade, but something in the expression—" She turned to look at Miller. "Perhaps I saw what I needed to see that day in the square." The honesty of her answer created a new intimacy between them, an acknowledgement of the complex reality that had brought them together. Before Miller could respond, the distant sound of vehicles entering the village broke the moment. They both moved to the window where they could see military trucks rolling into the square, not the usual German supply vehicles, but larger transports bearing unfamiliar markings. "Those are not Wehrmacht," Margaret said, tension evident in her voice. "No," Miller confirmed, his heart racing suddenly. "Those are SS." "Get away from the window," Miller said, pulling Margaret back from view. "The SS treats American prisoners differently than the Wehrmacht." "Why are they here?" Margaret asked, her face pale with fear. "Wiesenfeld has no strategic value." "Retreating," Miller surmised, peering cautiously around the curtain. "As the front collapses, they're moving eastward, probably to make a final stand closer to Berlin." He turned to Margarete, his expression grave. "I need to hide. The shed isn't safe enough." Margaret nodded immediately, moving toward a worn rug in the corner of the room. She pulled it aside to reveal a small trapdoor built into the wooden floor. "The root cellar," she explained. "Franz built it before he left. It's where we stored food for winter, but it's nearly empty now." Miller helped her lift the heavy door, revealing a ladder descending into darkness. The sound of truck engines grew louder as more vehicles entered the village. "Quickly!" Margaret urged, handing him a small oil lamp. "I will come for you when it's safe." Miller descended the ladder into a small underground space, perhaps 2 meters square, with rough dirt walls reinforced by wooden beams. A few withered potatoes and onions remained on a shelf, testament to the winter's scarcity. Margaret closed the trapdoor above him, and he heard the scrape of the rug being replaced. In the dim light of the oil lamp, Miller sat on the earthen floor, straining to hear what was happening above. Muffled voices, the thud of boots, doors opening and closing in neighboring houses, all suggested a thorough search of the village was underway. Time passed with excruciating slowness. Miller extinguished the lamp to conserve oil, sitting in complete darkness with only his thoughts for company. He reflected on the strange twist of fate that had brought him to this German village, to this woman's home, where he now hid in fear not only for himself but for her as well. If the SS discovered she had harbored an American prisoner, so especially one who had not been properly secured each night, the thought remained unfinished as the trapdoor suddenly opened, flooding the cellar with light. Miller tensed, ready to fight or flee, but it was Margaret who descended the ladder, her expression taut with worry. "They are conducting searches," she whispered. "Obersturmführer Weber is leading them. He demands that all villagers provide food and accommodations for his men." "How many?" Miller asked. "Perhaps 30, Margaret replied. "They claim to be regrouping before continuing eastward, but there are rumors—" She stopped, glancing nervously toward the open trapdoor. "What rumors?" "That they carry documents, important papers from Munich, and that they have prisoners with them." "Political prisoners," she shook her head. "The Bürgermeister tried to explain that we barely have enough food for ourselves, but they threatened to take what they need by force." Miller processed this information quickly. "If they're searching houses, they'll find this cellar." Margaret nodded. I must conceal it better, and you— She hesitated. I have an idea, but you won't like it. 2 hours later, Margaret opened her door to find Obersturmführer Weber and 2 SS soldiers on her doorstep. Weber, a tall man with cold eyes and a face prematurely aged by war, surveyed her with clinical detachment. Frau Hoffmann? He inquired, consulting a list of village residents. Yes, Margaret confirmed, forcing herself to meet his gaze. We are conducting searches of all properties, Weber stated without preamble. You will cooperate fully. Of course, Margaret stepped aside to allow them entry. Though I have little to offer in terms of supplies, I am a widow living alone. Weber made a non-committal sound as he and his men entered the cottage. His gaze swept the modest interior, lingering on the portrait above the fireplace. Your husband? He asked. Yes. Oberfeldwebel Franz Hoffmann. He fell at Leningrad. Weber nodded without sympathy. Many good German men have given their lives for the fatherland. He turned to his subordinates. Search thoroughly. The soldiers moved methodically through the small cottage, opening cupboards, looking under furniture, and checking the few storage spaces. Margaret stood still, her hands clasped to prevent their trembling from being noticed. One of the soldiers approached the rug covering the trapdoor, and Margaret felt her heart race. But instead of moving the rug, he simply walked across it, its newly nailed edges preventing it from shifting beneath his boots, the precaution she had taken while Miller waited in the shed. The shed outside as well, Weber instructed, and the 2 soldiers exited to search the outbuilding. Alone with Weber, Margaret felt a new tension. The officer studied her with uncomfortable intensity. You have been issued the standard rations? He inquired. Yes, Obersturmführer. And you grow supplemental food? He gestured toward the visible garden plot through the window. I try. It has been difficult alone. Margaret kept her voice steady, reciting the practiced explanation. A neighboring family helps when they can. Weber's attention was drawn to something on the table, a man's cap that Margaret had deliberately left visible, part of her desperate plan. Your husband's? Weber asked, picking up the cap. My brother's, Margaret lied smoothly. He visits from Münchberg when possible to help with the heavier work. He left only yesterday. The cap was actually Miller's, part of his American uniform that he had kept with him despite the risk. Now it served as a calculated distraction, explaining any male presence the SS might detect in the cottage. Weber replaced the cap and turned as his men re-entered from searching the shed. Nothing of note, one reported. Some tools, farming implements, a cot. My brother sleeps there when he visits, Margaret explained. The cottage is small. Weber seemed satisfied, making a notation on his list. Your property has been allocated to house 2 of my men for the duration of our stay, he informed her. They will require meals and basic accommodations. Margaret nodded, having expected this outcome. When will they arrive? This evening. Make necessary preparations. Weber moved toward the door, then stopped. One more thing, Frau Hoffmann. Have you seen any American prisoners in the area? We understand some were brought here for agricultural work. Yes, Obersturmführer. They work at several farms under guard. Sergeant Gruber from the Volkssturm oversees them, and none have been unaccounted for, no escapes or special arrangements. The question contained a trap, and Margaret recognized it immediately. If she denied knowledge and Weber already had contradictory information, she would be exposed as a liar. One prisoner works here during daylight hours, she admitted. Sergeant Gruber approved the arrangement. The prisoner returns to the village schoolhouse each evening. This partial truth, omitting that Miller had been staying in her shed, seemed to satisfy Weber, who nodded curtly. Ensure that arrangement continues exactly as described. Any deviation will be severely punished. After Weber and his men departed, Margaret waited a full hour before returning to the shed, where Miller had been hiding since their earlier conversation. He sat on the cot, tense and alert. They've gone, she informed him, her voice barely above a whisper. But 2 SS soldiers will be staying here beginning tonight. Miller absorbed this news grimly. The cellar won't work now. They'll be inside the house. No, Margaret agreed. But I have another idea. There's a hunting blind in the forest about 1 kilometer from here. Franz used it before the war. It's well hidden and might serve as temporary shelter. And if they track me there... Margaret's expression hardened with resolve. Then we will both face consequences, but what choice do we have? As dusk approached, Miller prepared to make his way to the forest blind. Margaret had provided him with civilian clothes, old garments belonging to Franz that fit him reasonably well, and a small pack containing food, matches, and a blanket. "The blind is due east," she explained, pointing toward the tree line visible from behind her cottage. "Follow the small stream until you see 3 large boulders on the right. The path leading up the hill will take you directly to it." "How will I know when it's safe to return?" Miller asked, acutely aware that their carefully constructed arrangement was collapsing around them. "I'll come when I can," Margaret promised. "But it may be several days. The SS commander said they are regrouping before moving on." Miller nodded, understanding the risk she was taking even having this conversation. "Margaret," he began, uncertain how to express the conflicted emotions of the moment. "Thank you. For everything." She stepped forward suddenly and embraced him, the first physical contact between them that had not been incidental to their work. "Be careful, James," she whispered, using his given name for the first time. Then she pulled away, composing herself. "Go now before the soldiers arrive." Miller made his way cautiously through the gathering darkness, using the last light of dusk to navigate toward the forest. He reached the tree line without incident and located the stream Margaret had described. Following it eastward, he remained alert for any signs of patrols or sentries. The forest was eerily quiet. The usual sounds of wildlife diminished, as if the creatures themselves sensed the dangerous presence that had entered their domain. Miller moved as silently as his military training had taught him, grateful now for the lessons that had once seemed tedious during his training in England. He found the 3 boulders and the path leading uphill, just as Margaret had described. The hunting blind was well concealed, a simple wooden structure built against a large tree, with branches and forest debris incorporated into its construction to render it nearly invisible unless one knew exactly where to look. Inside, the blind was cramped but serviceable. A narrow bench provided seating and could serve as a bed in a pinch. Small shuttered openings on 3 sides allowed for viewing the surrounding forest. Miller arranged his meager supplies, then settled in for what he anticipated would be a long and uncertain wait. Back at the cottage, Margaret prepared a simple meal for the 2 SS soldiers, who arrived precisely at 7 o'clock. Unlike Obersturmführer Weber, these men were younger, barely out of their teens, and displayed the nervous energy of those who had seen too much combat in too short a time. "You will sleep here," Margaret informed them, indicating the small sitting area where she had arranged blankets on the floor. "I have only the 1 bedroom. The soldiers, who introduced themselves as Müller and Schäfer, seemed relieved by the relative comfort of the cottage after what had evidently been a difficult retreat from the advancing Allied forces. "How long will you be staying in Wiesenfeld?" Margaret asked as they ate the potato soup and bread she had prepared. "Not long," Schäfer replied. 2 days, perhaps 3. Then we continue east." "To Berlin?" Margaret inquired cautiously. The 2 soldiers exchanged glances. "We follow orders," Müller said simply, ending the conversation. That night, as Margaret lay in her bed unable to sleep, she heard the soldiers talking in low voices in the front room. Their conversation, which they clearly assumed was private, revealed more than they had been willing to share at dinner. "The documents must reach Berlin," Müller was saying. "Weber says they contain research that could still turn the tide." "Nothing will turn the tide now," Schäfer responded bitterly. "Have you seen the maps? The Americans from the west, the Russians from the east. Where exactly do we go?" "The Alpine fortress," Müller suggested. "The southern redoubt. They've been preparing it for months." Schäfer made a dismissive sound. "A fantasy, like the miracle weapons and the promised reinforcements. None of it exists." "Then why are we guarding these scientists? Why protect their papers if they're worthless?" The mention of scientists caught Margaret's attention. The rumors of political prisoners had been correct, it seemed. "Orders are orders," Schäfer replied, his voice heavy with resignation. "We continue east in the morning." with or without the rest of the convoy. Margaret lay awake long after the soldiers' conversation ended, her mind racing. If the SS were transporting important research and scientists eastward, away from the approaching Americans, the implications were significant. Such information might be valuable to the Allied forces. But what could she do with this knowledge? She had no way to contact the approaching American army, no means of communicating what she had overheard. And even if she could, acting on such information would mark her as a traitor to Germany. Unless. The idea that formed in her mind was dangerous beyond measure. If caught, she would face execution without question. Yet as she considered the alternative, allowing the SS to escape with their human cargo and potentially valuable research, she found herself unable to dismiss the possibility of intervention. James Miller was not just any American prisoner. He was an educated man, a former teacher who understood languages and history. If anyone could comprehend the significance of what she had overheard, it would be him. Decision made, Margaret waited until the pre-dawn hours when the soldiers' breathing indicated deep sleep. Moving with painstaking care, she slipped from her bedroom and collected a few essential items: food, a kitchen knife for protection, and a small first aid kit. She left a note on the kitchen table stating she had gone to check on a sick neighbor, in case the soldiers woke before her return. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten as Margaret made her way toward the forest. The dew-wet grass soaked the hem of her dress, and the morning chill cut through her thin jacket, but she pressed on with determined steps. She found the stream, located the 3 boulders, and followed the path up the hillside to the hunting blind. "James," she called softly as she approached, not wanting to startle him. "It's Margaret." Miller appeared at the blind's entrance, relief evident on his face. "What's happened?" he asked immediately, noting her tense expression. Inside the confined space of the blind, Margaret related what she had overheard. The documents, the scientists, the planned movement eastward. Miller listened intently, his historian's mind quickly grasping the strategic implications. "If they're evacuating scientific personnel and research," he said when she had finished, "it could be weapons development, industrial processes, or medical research. All would be valuable to whichever Allied power captures them." "What can we do?" Margaret asked. "I cannot simply allow them to leave with these people, especially if they are being transported against their will." Miller studied her face in the dim light, filtering through the blind's shutters. "Margaret, why are you telling me this? Why risk everything to share information that helps the American forces?" The question forced her to confront motivations she had not fully examined. "Because this war has taken everything from me," she said finally. "My husband, my security, my future. The Germany I loved died long before the first bomb fell. If I can help end this madness even one day sooner, save even one life." She met his gaze steadily. "And because I trust you." Miller nodded slowly. "The American lines are still some distance away, but advanced reconnaissance units may be operating closer. If we could somehow delay the SS convoy's departure." "The bridge," Margaret suggested suddenly. "There's only one road eastward suitable for heavy vehicles. It crosses a small river about 5 kilometers from the village. The bridge is old, but sturdy. If it were damaged, that would force them to either repair it or find an alternate route," Miller finished, following her logic. "Either way, it buys time for the American forces to advance closer." "We could do it tonight," Margareta proposed. "The soldiers staying with me mentioned they would be joining a planning meeting this evening. My absence might go unnoticed for several hours." The plan took shape between them, simple but desperately dangerous. They would make their way to the bridge after dark, where Miller would use his combat engineering training to damage the structure sufficiently to render it impassable without appearing to be sabotage. With luck, it would be attributed to structural failure rather than deliberate action. As Margaret prepared to return to the village, Miller caught her arm. "If we're discovered," he said gravely, "claim I forced you to help me. Say I threatened you. It might save your life." Margaret shook her head firmly. "This is my choice, James. I will accept the consequences, whatever they may be." The day passed with agonizing slowness for both of them. Margaret returned to her cottage, finding the soldiers still asleep, her absence unnoticed. She went about her normal routine, tending the garden, preparing meals, and maintaining the fiction of ordinary life while her mind raced with plans for the evening's sabotage. For Miller, the hours dragged in solitude, his thoughts alternating between tactical considerations and concern for Margaret. The woman had become far more than a pragmatic alliance of convenience. He found himself caring deeply about her safety, perhaps more than was wise given their circumstances. As darkness fell, Margaret made her way once again to the hunting blind. The soldiers had departed for their meeting as expected, giving her a window of opportunity. She found Miller ready and waiting, dressed in the civilian clothes she had provided. "Are you certain about this?" he asked one final time as they prepared to set out for the bridge. "Completely," she replied without hesitation. They moved through the forest in silence, following game trails rather than the main road to avoid detection. The night was clear but moonless, providing good cover for their clandestine mission. After an hour's careful progress, they reached a vantage point overlooking the bridge Margareta had described. To their dismay, they discovered the bridge was guarded. 2 SS soldiers stood at the near end, smoking cigarettes and conversing quietly. Their presence complicated an already dangerous plan. "We need a distraction," Miller whispered, surveying the scene from their concealed position. Margaret nodded, her mind working quickly. "There's a maintenance shed about 50 meters downriver," she said. "It contains tools for road repairs. If we could create a diversion there." "I'll check the shed," Miller decided. "Wait here." Before Margaret could object, he had slipped away, moving with the practiced stealth of a combat soldier. She watched anxiously as his dark figure disappeared into the night, then forced herself to remain patient and still. Minutes passed like hours until Miller finally returned, his expression grim but determined. "The shed has what we need," he reported. "Blasting caps and a small amount of explosive, probably used for clearing rocks during road construction. It's more than enough for our purposes." "The guards?" Margaret asked. "I'll create a diversion downriver," G. Miller explained. "Once they investigate, you'll signal if it's clear for me to approach the bridge." The plan was simple but effective. Miller placed a small charge near the maintenance shed, setting a 5-minute fuse before returning to Margaret's position. When the explosion came, it was louder than expected, a sharp crack followed by the crash of the shed's roof partially collapsing. The guards reacted immediately, both running toward the source of the disturbance with weapons drawn. Margaret watched them go, then gave Miller the signal they had arranged. 3 flashes with a small mirror reflecting the distant light from the village. Miller moved quickly, descending to the bridge with the remaining explosives. His combat engineering training proved invaluable as he identified the structure's key support points and placed the charges for maximum effect with minimum material. He worked efficiently, aware that every passing minute increased their risk of discovery. The charges set, Miller rejoined Margaret at their observation point. 3-minute fuse, he informed her tensely. "We should move further back." They retreated deeper into the forest, finding cover behind a fallen tree approximately 200 meters from the bridge. The guards had not yet returned, presumably still investigating the shed explosion. "When this is over," Miller said suddenly, the words emerging unbidden, "when the Americans arrive and the war ends, what will you do?" The question caught Margaret off guard. "I haven't allowed myself to think beyond survival," she admitted. "Perhaps return to teaching if schools reopen." "And you? Back to Pennsylvania and your classroom?" Miller was silent for a long moment. "Everything seems different now. What I thought I wanted before the war, I'm not sure it matters anymore." Before Margaret could respond, the night was split by a second explosion, this one more substantial than the first. The bridge didn't collapse entirely as they had hoped, but the central span sagged visibly, rendering it impassable to vehicles. "Time to go," Miller urged, taking Margaret's hand as they began a rapid retreat toward the safety of the forest depths. They had covered perhaps half the distance back to the hunting blind when the sound of pursuit reached them, voices calling in German, the beams of flashlights cutting through the trees behind them. "They're following our trail," Miller realized with dismay. "The ground is too soft. We left tracks." Margaret's face was pale but determined in the faint light. "The stream," she suggested. "If we follow it, the water will hide our tracks." They changed direction, making for the small waterway that ran through the forest. The sounds of pursuit grew louder, indicating their hunters were gaining ground. When they reached the stream, they waded into the cold water, following its course downstream to obscure their trail. The icy water numbed Margaret's feet through her thin shoes, but she pressed on without complaint, drawing on reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed. Beside her, Miller moved with the focused intensity of a soldier behind enemy lines, which she realized was precisely what he was. After following the stream for nearly a kilometer, they emerged and made their way back toward the hunting blind. The sounds of pursuit had faded, suggesting their stratagem had worked, at least temporarily. "They'll search the entire area by morning," Miller predicted grimly as they reached the relative safety of the blind. "This hiding place won't remain secure for long." "Then we must leave before dawn," Margaret decided. "Head west toward the American lines." Miller looked at her in surprise. "We?" "Margaret, if you flee with me, you can never return. You'll be branded a traitor." "What is there to return to?" she asked simply. "An empty house, a life built on lies about a husband who will never come home. At least this way, I choose my own path." The conviction in her voice silenced any further argument. They spent the remaining hours of darkness gathering what supplies they could and planning a route westward that avoided main roads and populated areas. As the first light of dawn broke through the trees, they set out. An American soldier and a German widow, unlikely allies in a war that had destroyed millions of lives and reshaped the world. Their journey was arduous. They traveled by night and hid during daylight hours, subsisting on whatever food they could forage or obtain from isolated farmhouses where Margaret's German allowed her to barter small items of jewelry for bread and cheese. They avoided villages entirely, aware that news of the bridge sabotage and subsequent manhunt would have spread. On the third day, as they rested in an abandoned hunting cabin, Margaret found herself studying Miller's face as he slept, the face that had so resembled her lost husband's, yet had become distinctly its own in her mind. The initial confusion of identity that had brought them together now seemed a distant memory, replaced by a connection based on shared danger and growing trust. When Miller woke to find her watching him, he didn't comment on it directly. Instead, he asked, "What was he like, your husband?" Margaret considered the question carefully. "Kind," she said finally. "Quiet. He loved working with his hands, creating things from wood, building rather than destroying. He was a good man caught in terrible times." "You loved him very much," Miller observed. "Yes," Margaret agreed simply, "which is why I know he would understand this." She gestured vaguely, encompassing their current situation and alliance. "Franz believed in doing what was right, even when it was difficult." Miller nodded, accepting her assessment. "When we reach the American lines," he said, changing the subject, "I'll need to report to my unit, but I'll do everything possible to ensure you're treated well." "I understand," Margaret replied. "I have few illusions about how a German woman will be received." "These are unusual circumstances," Miller pointed out. "Your actions against the SS convoy will count in your favor." The conversation was interrupted by the distant sound of vehicles. Heavy trucks moving along a road perhaps a kilometer to the west. They exchanged glances, both recognizing the implications. "Those could be American vehicles," Miller said, hope evident in his voice. They gathered their few possessions and moved cautiously westward, staying under the cover of the forest while working their way toward the source of the sounds. As they drew closer, Miller's excitement grew. "Those are American engines," he confirmed. "I'd recognize that sound anywhere." They reached the edge of the forest, finding themselves overlooking a secondary road where several U.S. Army trucks were indeed passing. Miller's expression transformed with relief and pride at the sight of his countrymen. "Wait here," he instructed Margaret. "Let me approach them first, explain the situation." Margaret nodded, suddenly uncertain. After days of shared danger and reliance on each other, the prospect of returning to their respective sides of the conflict, even as that conflict was ending, filled her with unexpected apprehension. Miller squeezed her hand reassuringly. "Trust me," he said simply, then moved out from the forest cover and down the slope toward the road, his hands raised to show he was unarmed. From her position, Margaret watched as the American soldiers initially reacted with alarm, weapons raised, until Miller called out in English and identified himself. There followed a flurry of activity, officers summoned, documents checked, Miller gesturing repeatedly toward the forest where she waited. Finally, a jeep arrived carrying what appeared to be a senior officer. After a brief conversation with Miller, the officer nodded and dispatched 2 soldiers who began making their way up the slope toward Margaret's position. "Frau Hoffmann," Miller called in German, "it's safe to come down. These men will escort you." Taking a deep breath, Margaret stepped from the concealment of the trees and allowed herself to be guided down to the road. The American soldiers treated her with cautious respect, neither friendly nor hostile, a professional neutrality she found oddly comforting after the extreme emotions of the past weeks. At the roadside, Miller stood with the officer, who introduced himself in accented but serviceable German as Major Wilson. "Sergeant Miller has explained your situation," Wilson informed her. "If his account is accurate, you've taken considerable risks to assist an American prisoner and sabotage enemy movements." "It is accurate," Margaret confirmed. "Then you'll be treated as a friendly civilian," Wilson assured her. "We'll need to debrief you both, of course, about the SS convoy and the scientists you mentioned." In the days that followed, Margaret and Miller were transported to an American field headquarters, where they were separated for individual debriefing. Margaret provided everything she knew about the SS unit in Wiesenfeld, their numbers, equipment, the snippets of conversation she had overheard about documents and scientists. When asked about her motivations for helping an American prisoner and undertaking sabotage against German forces, she spoke with simple honesty. "The Germany I loved died years ago," she explained to the intelligence officer interviewing her. "What remained was something I could no longer recognize or support." After 3 days of questioning, Margaret was assigned quarters in a requisitioned German house that the Americans had converted to accommodate civilian consultants and refugees of special interest. The conditions were basic but comfortable: a private room, regular meals, and the novel luxury of hot water for bathing. It was there, on her 5th day in American custody, that Miller finally came to see her. He wore a clean uniform with his sergeant's stripes clearly visible, looking more like the soldier he was than the prisoner and fugitive she had known. "They're sending me back to my unit tomorrow," he informed her without preamble. "The 101st is preparing for occupation duties." "I see," Margaret replied, unsure what response was expected of her. Miller shifted uncomfortably, clearly struggling with what he wanted to say. "The intelligence officers were impressed with your information. They're offering you a position as a translator and cultural liaison for the occupation administration." Margaret absorbed this news with surprise. "They trust me that much?" "I vouched for you," Miller said simply, "and your actions speak for themselves." "And after the occupation, what then?" Miller hesitated, then plunged ahead. "I've applied for permission to sponsor your immigration to the United States when that becomes possible. If you wanted to. Start over. Somewhere new." The offer hung between them, laden with unspoken implications. Margaret studied Miller's face, the face that had first attracted her attention because of its resemblance to Franz, but which she now saw as entirely its own. "Why would you do this for me?" she asked quietly. Miller met her gaze directly. "Because in the midst of the worst humanity has to offer, you showed me the best. Because you risked everything to do what was right. Because—" he stopped, gathering himself. "Because I've come to care for you, Margaret. More than I should, perhaps." Margaret felt tears threatening, not of sadness but of a complex emotion she couldn't quite name. "I don't know if I can leave Germany," she admitted. "Despite everything, it's my home." "I understand," Miller assured her quickly. "The offer remains open. Whatever you decide, I just wanted you to know you have options." They parted that day with no promises made, only possibilities acknowledged. Miller returned to his unit, and Margaret began her work with the occupation administration, using her language skills and local knowledge to help bridge the cultural divide between occupiers and occupied. Weeks passed, becoming months. The formal surrender of Germany marked the official end of the war in Europe, though for most Germans, the surrender merely confirmed what they had long known: That defeat was inevitable and complete. The country lay in ruins, its cities bombed to rubble, its economy shattered, its population traumatized and hungry. Through her position with the occupation forces, Margaret was able to visit Wiesenfeld briefly in June. The village had been spared major destruction, but was changed nonetheless. The SS unit had departed the day after the bridge sabotage, taking their mysterious scientists and documents with them. Whether they had eventually reached their destination or been captured by advancing Allied forces remained unknown. Margaret's cottage stood empty, partly looted but structurally intact. Standing in the main room, she found herself looking up at the portrait of Franz, still hanging above the fireplace. It seemed to belong to another lifetime, a Germany and a Margaret that no longer existed. She removed the portrait carefully from the wall and packed it among the few personal possessions she had come to collect. Whatever path she chose, Franz would remain part of her story, the first chapter rather than the complete book. As summer turned to autumn, Margarete received word that her application for emigration to the United States had been approved, sponsored by Technical Sergeant James Miller, recently discharged from the U.S. Army, and returned to his teaching position in Pennsylvania. The letter included a personal note from Miller himself. "The choice remains yours," and he wrote, "but know that there is a place for you here if you want it. Not as a replacement for what you've lost, but as a new beginning. Whatever you decide, I remain forever grateful that fate brought me to Wiesenfeld and to you." On a clear October morning in 1945, Margarete Hoffmann stood at the rail of a transport ship departing from Bremerhaven. Behind her lay the shattered remains of the country she had once loved. Ahead, an uncertain future in a land she knew only through books and films and the stories of one American soldier who had once been mistaken for her husband. The decision had not come easily. For weeks she had wrestled with questions of loyalty, identity, and belonging. Was leaving Germany an act of abandonment, or one of courage? Was her attraction to Miller genuine, or merely a product of their shared ordeal? What obligations did she still hold to the memory of Franz? In the end, what decided her was a conversation with Elsa Bauer, whom she had encountered by chance during her visit to Wiesenfeld. "Franz would want you to live, Margaret," Elsa had said simply. "Not just survive, but truly live again." As the German coastline receded into the distance, Margaret reflected on the strange journey that had brought her to this moment. A case of mistaken identity, or perhaps fate's intervention, had connected her with an American prisoner who resembled her lost husband. That coincidence had led to an unlikely alliance, a dangerous mission, and eventually a chance for a new beginning. 6 weeks later, on a snowy December afternoon, James Miller waited at Philadelphia's port as the ship carrying Margaret Hoffmann docked after its long Atlantic crossing. He spotted her immediately among the disembarking passengers, her auburn hair now worn loose rather than hidden beneath a headscarf, her posture straight despite the uncertainty that must have filled her. When their eyes met across the crowded pier, no words were necessary. In that moment, both recognized that while the war had taken much from them, it had also, through its strange and terrible alchemy, given them something precious in return, the chance to build something new from the ruins of what had been destroyed. In the years that followed, James and Margaret would create a life together in a small Pennsylvania town, where he returned to teaching history, and she eventually became a professor of German literature at a nearby college. They would raise 2 children, travel back to a rebuilding Germany in the 1950s, and maintain correspondence with Elsa Bauer until her death in 1967. The portrait of Franz Hoffmann would hang in their study, not as a ghost between them, but as an acknowledgement of the past that had shaped them both. James never sought to replace Franz in Margaret's memory, understanding that her heart was expansive enough to honor what had been while embracing what was. When asked by friends or colleagues how they had met, Margaret and James would share an abbreviated version of their story, omitting the more dangerous elements. "He was an American soldier, and I was a German civilian," Margaret would say simply. "We found each other at the end of the war." But in private, they remembered the fuller truth, how a moment of mistaken identity had led to an unlikely connection across enemy lines, how shared danger had forged an unbreakable bond, and how amid humanity's darkest hour, they had discovered that compassion and courage could transcend the artificial boundaries of nationality and conflict. Their story was not unique in the vast tapestry of World War II, where millions of lives intersected in ways both tragic and transformative. Yet in its specificity, a German widow, an American prisoner, a striking resemblance, and a series of choices made in the face of impossible circumstances, it captured something essential about the human capacity to find connection even in the midst of division, to choose a future not determined by the hatreds of the past. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.